Dean sir, we can start probably.
Oh, okay.
Bob,
Okay, yes. Welcome everyone to a new episode of Rapid's monthly webinar series. We have a very, very interesting topic at hand this time. Labor market synopsis of South Asia and the fiscal space, an SDG perspective. We have a very, very interesting panel today. We have, starting off, we'll have Mr. Nazmul Ovi Hossain, labor economist working for ILO, followed by Dr. Yanatul Islam, adjunct professor, Griffith University, Australia, former branch chief, ILO Geneva. The session will be moderated by our very own Dr. Dean Islam, research director, Rapid. Without further ado, please, I give the floor to Dean, sir.
thank you very much, Bob, and very good evening to you all. And thank you very much for joining us today's webinar. So just to inform you that our webinar is to promote young researchers, to give them the platform so that they can present their work, their research work, and connect with researchers doing similar research. But occasionally we invite experts like Professor Islam so that our young generation know what are the issues, policy, especially policy issues in the relevant field. We are very grateful to Professor Islam and Nadmul Obi Hussain for presenting their work today. And I hope this will inspire our young researchers. Before going to them for presentation, I'd like to request our Executive Director, Professor Dr. Abu Yusuf, if you can quickly provide a brief speech, introductory speech. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Din Islam and Rubab Bahar. Let's welcome our very respected Dr. Ayanatul Islam, adjunct professor, Griffith University, and also former branch chief, ILO Geneva. And also, we'd like to welcome Mr. Nazmul Avi Hussain, labor economist working for ILO. Dean, thank you very much. You already mentioned that this is our regular webinar series, but mainly targeting the young researcher, mid-level researcher working or doing their higher studies in different universities across the globe. They usually do the presentation, but today is different because personality like I am Professor Anatul Islam, so we hardly have this opportunity to hear from a personality like him. On behalf of Rapid, we are really grateful to him for his time. I know maybe if he is in Australia, it is a midnight, I think, in Australia. So really grateful to you. Hopefully, our researcher, and also it is on Facebook Live, so other participants, they will be enormously benefited from his presentation and also from the presentation by Ovi. So let's welcome, and without further, I would like to hear from the speakers, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusuf sir. So let's now go straight to our presenters. Ovi, if you can kindly take next 15 minutes, 20 minutes to share
Thank you.
your research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Din Islam, and thank you, Professor Yusuf as well for nicely introducing us. So I think without further delay, the way we will go today is the first issue of the labor market and SDGs will be presented by me. This is a joint work that I did with Dr. Yanatul Islam, I think last year. And then on the second work we just completed, that's on the fiscal space to finance SDGs. That will be presented by Dr. Yanatul Islam. So ideally, this is not a kind of academic research that we are going to present here. Mostly it is a policy work for the policymakers in the space of development cooperation, UN, ILO, all sorts of relevant space and stakeholders. So without further delay, I am going to share my screen. I think just a moment. So I think my screen should appear. Is my screen visible?
It's coming up. Yes.
Okay. So this is a first topic I think that we wanted to highlight for today's discussion. This is basically a work that was done in 2022, and the topic is, as you can see, the confronting labor market challenges in South Asia and SDG perspective. So in the Griffith University, there is a Griffith Asia Institute where this piece has been published as a policy brief in the social economic outlook and South Asia strategy outlook. So without, further delay, I think it's very important to notice the key labor market features that we have in the region. So in this work, we highlighted the labor market common issues and challenges and constraints in the South Asian countries, but also gave emphasized on the Bangladesh chapter specifically. So I think it's really important that South Asia adopt right kind of policy instruments, identifying the right labor market tools to overcoming the labor market challenges that the country has. And ideally, as you see that there are three main challenges that we identified in South Asian labor market. One is definitely we all know that is a huge informal economy in South Asia. And ideally, in all the countries, the volume is more than 80%. And if we speak about Bangladesh, is more than 85%. And there is a persistent gender disparity, because even if we consider that how much of the labor force is in the how much of the female are in the labor force in South Asian countries on an average is not more than 25% for all the countries. And in Bangladesh also, we have seen that the female labor force participation is a big concern. And there is obviously a gender disparity and, of course, a kind of benefit and the wages that female labor force participants get is also very discriminatory in a sense that on an average, as you see, the per capita GDP could increase as much as 58% in South Asia with removal of this gender disparity. And there is a wage disparity among gender, which we will focus a little bit later in the next slides. And the third thing, which often we do not speak, is the underutilization of the skills of the youth. And we all have experienced what happened in July in Bangladesh in August that started with the unemployment or labor market lack of jobs circumstances for the youth, where we have seen that there are not enough jobs for the youth to enter in the market. This is a problem that is one fold. And on the second fold, the another problem is who are in the job market and the labor market, they are not utilized at their best in terms of their skills and talent. And in ILO, there is a term, of course, in labor force survey, we also have these numbers that is called underemployment. So that's a big concern for developing countries, I think, the underemployment compared to the unemployment. Because in an informal market, finding job is not very difficult compared to work in some sort of job that is decent and also that maximizes the utilization of the labor force and workforce. So these are the three challenges we identified. Now, going to the next slide, I think, as you can see, I will now share some comparator. And sorry for the figure number because I put it from our paper directly. So that is why you would see different numbers, but ignore that, please. So I think one of the indicators that we all are aware is the NEET population, and there is the population that is called the people who are not in education, employment, or training. So if you see the percentage in the South Asian countries, you would see that the more or less, I think the numbers are quite large. And starting from Bangladesh, that is above 27%. And Nepal and Pakistan definitely are leading in terms of the percentage of NEET population. And of course, if you see India, that also has 30.7% of NEET population who are not in the on the education, employment, and training. And this population is basically the youth. So here we have tried to extract the figures not for the overall working age population, but tried to categorize just only for the youth who are into the age group of 15 to 24, as of ILO definition. And a large concerning factor is, if you see in terms of numbers for countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, the kind of total population and the number of youth these countries have, the total number is going to be huge compared to the percentage of Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. So, like for India, this 30.7% is going to be a huge in total number. So I think this is the scenario of need in South Asia. So in terms of the next two indicators that we try to exploit is the mean of average weekly hours of actual work from 2005 to 2022. That on an average, what is the mean of the average weekly hours? Because usually the labor force survey captures the average weekly hours worked per household or worker, and from there ILO actually modeled the estimation of the mean of those average weekly hours that is actually being worked. So as you can see, the number in Maldives is below, is everywhere it is above 40 hours per week, or at least close to the 50 hours per week. So easily you can see that in terms of decent working conditions, where a person, even if in full-time job, should not be working more than 38 to 40 hours, is something on an average the South Asian countries are not following. So extra hours of work is always there. I think that is why the decent work indicators and the targets become very relevant for these countries to improve this hourly working conditions. And what is even more surprising, that in terms of productivity, a lot of working hours not necessarily results in higher productivity in this region. And if you see, another very important discussion that our paper tried to argue is on the social protection avenue, because social protection is one of the instrument that is very directly linked with the employment and the decent working condition. Because if social protection is not there, I mean, it is very difficult to save the vulnerable workers who can lose jobs and who can be unemployed, or any kind of labor market incidents takes place. The coverage of social protection saves the workers from getting out of the labor market, or also helps saves the worker to come back to the labor market and also stay out of the poverty. So if you see the population who are covered by at least one social protection benefit, you see the number is terribly poor in all the South Asian countries, where Sri Lanka is doing better in terms of the at least one social protection coverage as a percentage of the population. And India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh are almost at the same page, with Nepal being the lowest. So that's important. And the thing that I just discussed previously, that there is a gender pay gap. I mean, if you see the female wages as a percentage of male wages, that's also calculated by ILO stat and estimated from the labor force survey data. And I think they also use a little bit on the household income and expenditure survey. So if you see that from different years from the available data, we are sorry that we could not update at that time using the labor force survey 2022 of Bangladesh. That's why you will see is 2017, because at that time 22 was not available. But as the paper tried to argue that there exists a discrimination and gender pay gap, except for Pakistan. If you can see, you will find that the gender pay gap in all the countries exist. And this is something which can be attributed to large share of the informal economy, of course. And also, if you see the female representation at the managerial level in these countries, which is basically one of the SDG indicators, I think it should be something around 5.5.2 in the gender SDG target, where you have a senior representation or managerial position, how many women and female have been working. So that's also not very good for the South Asian countries. So going forward, I think now a little bit on the Bangladesh labor market specific situation. So what I tried to show here is ideally, if you can see that the highlighted part, comparing the 2017 and 2022, in Bangladesh, the number of own account workers have significantly increased in past 5 years. If you see the numbers in millions in the highlighted part, and by also the same type of indicator, you can see the self-employed workers. So that is also something that has significantly jumped over the time, and it is even severe for the female workers. You can see in the yellow numbers. And what does it mean? It means clearly that in 5 years, from 2017 to 2022, the number of workers who are working as vulnerable workers and employee in the labor market has increased, because this own account contributing to the family workers does not really contribute a lot to the productive and economic growth and jobs which have decent working condition and decent working component, with no security and almost nothing. And also in the self-employment, you would find precarious employment status, no contract, no specific working hours, wage discrimination, poor labor rights and collective bargaining situation, and absolutely in sometimes nothing. So this is a kind of dangerous signal for the country. One of the reasons might be the survey was done in the COVID-19 period, but then again, I mean, in general, it is also a concerning factor that in the country, the increase in vulnerable and self-employed workers is enhancing, which needs to be taken care by the policymakers in terms of employment and labor market policy. And I will not take much time in my next few slides. And as you can see, this circle that I marked in red, you will see the labor force participation rates. The difference you would notice age-wise, the orange is for the young and youth. You will see that in the female labor force participation, it is significantly, sharply increased in the rural areas. And also for the male, and especially for the youth, you will see that the rural labor force participation has increased for both male and female. Where female, it has sharply increased, but for male, it has increased not that significantly, but still increased. So I think this is kind of thing that is also a big question that comes up as a policy challenge, that whether Bangladesh is going towards deindustrialized economic pathway. Because, I mean, ideally, with the motivation of graduating from LDC and economic structural transformation, the country was showing good progress from 2013 to 17 by increasing its employment and labor share in the manufacturing sector compared to the agriculture. But here you can see that the labor force participation is increasing in the agriculture sector, especially for the female. And also there are evidence that the employment share has also significantly increased in the agriculture sector compared to the manufacturing, where the employment share in the manufacturing actually decreased. So this is a big kind of signal and a really concerning factor for the country that wants to graduate from LDC and be a middle income country soon. Now, another important thing for Bangladesh is the wage. So from different ILO statistics department data, so we have calculated this real wage growth and trend. And as you can see by the blocks, the South Asian countries, you would see that for Bangladesh, especially, except for Sri Lanka, in some cases, real wages actually increased. And also for India, the real wage is pretty much increased at some point, then it started to decrease and decline. But Bangladesh, except for I think 2009 and 2014, you would see highly less likely the case is that real wage is increasing. If it is increasing, it is very negligible. And in many cases, it is actually in the declining and the negative trend. Now, in the ILO Asia Pacific Social Outlook and Economic Outlook report in 2023, has identified that the labor productivity of the country right now is 4.1%. I mean, it was estimation until 2023. It was 4.1%. It was recorded there in the ILO Regional Asia Pacific Social Outlook report. And to meet the ambition of Bangladesh becoming a high income country by 2050, the labor productivity has to go and meet at least 6%. So I think with the declining real wage and this declining trend, it is very difficult to also promote increase in the labor productivity in the labor market. So that is, I think, the most of the things. And the last one, I would say, as I was speaking, that the manufacturing labor market share, if you see the sectoral employment just for youth, you would find that the manufacturing sector is facing a declining share of employment among youth. And the agriculture share of the youth employment is increasing in Bangladesh. So ideally, this is the thing that I previously wanted to speak about. So I think last slide for me, I think with the number, this is a little bit on the labor productivity, growth rate of the labor productivity and average annual growth rate of real wages. So if you see that in manufacturing, the productivity growth rate is calculated from two labor force survey 2 points, 11.5%, where the average annual growth rate of real wages is a negative. And also for so many other sectors, you will see the same thing, that the productivity is good, the productivity is going high, but the real wage is going down and it's negative. So there is a total normative story behind it, where ILO is ideally helping and working in this country and the other member states, that if the productivity is high but the wage is declining and the real wage and workers are not getting the right kind of wages and income, then the question comes that definitely in those sectors the workers are being exploited and they have been extracted to the level where they are producing with a higher productivity and the output is going better, and businesses maybe also are running well, but they are not getting the wages they should. So there is a whole policy question about, I think Niran joined. I saw that our labor administration cluster program manager Niran, who is closely leading this area of work on wage and collective bargaining. So I think where we are jointly working to support Bangladesh to having a national wage policy where the minimum wage setting mechanism should be identified with evidence and gender responsively. And of course, I mean, there is a question to set those benchmarks and calculate those minimum wage thresholds. In many cases of those 44 identified minimum wage board sectors, those have been not been revised in many cases for 10, 12 years at least. So I think that puts a big demand for the country to go for a wage policy setting mechanism with standard minimum or living wage thresholds. So last but not the least, I think we came up with three recommendations. One is, of course, that there has to be a comprehensive national employment policy with an active implementation plan in coordination with several key stakeholders, including Labor Ministry, Finance Division, Commerce Ministry, Ministry of Industry, and the other government entities like SME Foundation, even the central bank. There has to be a robust labor market governance to tackle the gender disparity, improve the working condition, and definitely there has to be private-public investment where investment and financing should be smooth to create jobs, which is basically our second paper that Professor Yan will be speaking about. So thank you from my end. So now I would like to invite Professor Yan for the next presentation.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Saudi. Yes, please, Professor.
No. Shall I? I'll start. I'll see if
Please
I
go ahead.
can. Yeah, I'll see if I can get the. Avi, do you want to?
I can, sir. No problem.
Yeah,
Give me some time. I will share your
yeah.
slides.
It says NSU at top, on the top. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Right.
visible, right, sir?
Yes. So,
Just give me a nod for the next one when you want to shift
yeah,
to the next slide.
sure. Well, first of all, before I start, let me take this opportunity to record my deep appreciation for this particular engagement. This is my first engagement with Rapid, and it is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share some ideas and fairly straightforward, simple, but policy-focused work that Avi and I have been doing for the Griffith Asia Institute. The particular topic is rethinking fiscal policy to finance SDGs. And in this case, by SDGs, we are going to focus mainly on SDGs as they pertain to the labor market. We have seen in the case of Avi's presentation that there are massive policy challenges in terms of the labor market. And we're going to just provide a broad indication of how fiscal policies can be used to support the achievement of the SDGs, focusing, as I said, on labor market. This means decent work, social protection, as well as just transition to a net zero economy. Because climate change, whether we like it or not, does have significant, if not major, labor market ramifications that will intensify over time in the case of a business as usual scenario. Before I start, just make sure everybody can hear me clearly enough. Is that clear enough? Or in audio terms? Lovely. So, as I said, it's just an illustration in terms of the strategies and tools. We're not we're not discovering something phenomenal. It's essentially putting together and highlighting ideas that are well known but still needs repeating and emphasizing. Okay, so the next slide. We all know the financing gap. It's rather large, around trillions of dollars at current prices, and therefore enormous fiscal resources would be needed. And key element of harnessing fiscal resources is what we call strategic budgeting. And the primary goal of strategic budgeting is domestic revenue mobilization. The next slide, please. Shall we move on? Okay. This is just an estimate for a number of South Asian countries, including Bangladesh. And the green lines simply show the total spending needs as estimated by the IMF using data from 2023. And the idea is how much would be needed to reach the SDGs by 2030 as a percentage of GDP. In Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. And as you can see, Pakistan, in terms of expenditure on health, education, sanitation facilities, electricity, and roads. So I'll just focus on the totals. And of course, these are the key areas of public expenditure that has a direct and indirect bearing in terms of enhancing the welfare of ordinary citizens, as well as creating employment opportunities. So when you spend on health, education, on sanitation, electrification, roads, and so on and so forth, you are also creating job opportunities. So that really is the idea. In a sense, it's basically infrastructure spending. And according to the IMF, the spending needs are indeed absolutely enormous, particularly in Pakistan and Bangladesh. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, sorry. If you could summarize the findings, you could go back one slide, right? So, just to emphasize, 15% of GDP in the case of Bangladesh and Pakistan, a little less in Sri Lanka, and both India and Nepal seem to be well positioned. Okay, if you could go. All right. Instead of focusing on all these, horizontal bars, we will just summarize the findings. I'm conscious of the fact that it's already 8:34, And I'm sure that we would be better served in terms of an interactive session. So we'll just focus on the summary of the findings rather than the pictures. Okay. So what's happening? What's the status quo? Well, all the South Asian countries spend less than 2% of GDP in terms of annual social assistance, with Nepal and India spending a bit more. And they also allocate fairly modest levels of public expenditure towards health, education, sanitation, electricity, roads, as well as social protection assistance. And that leads to a scarcity of decent employment opportunities, and at the same time denudes the productive potential of our citizens in the region. That really is the message, that it's not spending enough. And the point is, it probably cannot spend enough. If we could move on. So how do we deal with that? So here we come up with this notion of looking at budgeting in a slightly different way. Normally, when we do a budgeting exercise or when we conceptualize or enact and implement fiscal policy, in a traditional, conventional way, there is an enormous emphasis on managing debts and deficits in terms of meeting particular thresholds. And then if that allows you to engender fiscal sustainability, then we give good marks to that particular country, that fiscal policy is doing well because they're meeting prudential thresholds on debts and deficits. Debts are not going out of control, deficits are not going out of control. While this is certainly necessary, this particular approach is not sufficient and indeed ill-equipped to respond to the challenges that are embedded in trying to attain the SDGs. So how do we then move to a budgeting framework that allows us to be a lot more conscious about how SDGs can drive fiscal policy? And this is this idea of SDG budgeting, which is a particular example of strategic budgeting that by now is well-established practice in the OECD. So the idea, therefore, is to use approaches like budget tagging that tracks national budgetary expenditures according to SDGs, SDG aligned budget performance report, calculating financing gaps, and integrating them even into local budgets. If we could do, this is just a wish list of what should be done, an aspirational set of propositions of what could be done, but this really takes the budgeting framework away from a traditional focus on deficit and debt management to something that focuses on important goals like attaining the SDGs. That has direct impact on employment and earning opportunities of workers. Okay, Avi, the next slide, please. Could we go to the next one, please, Avi? Lovely. And this is an example of how this can be done. And this is not just, this is from the UNDP, which is helping member countries of the UN to support SDG budgeting. It's also known as Integrated National Financing Framework. And here I would be remiss in terms of my responsibility if I do not highlight the fact that Avi himself was involved in such an exercise, I think for Bangladesh. And what it is basically developing a financing strategy, a whole of government financing strategy, as opposed to a sectoral financing strategy. Assessment, diagnostics, governance, coordination, and monitoring and review. So the approach is actually quite different from conventional budgeting. If you could go to the next one, Avi, thank you. And what kind of strategies? So assuming that a country is indeed SDG budgeting, what else? What kind of strategies are required? Well, certainly revenue mobilization. And we will suggest how we can manage debts and deficits in this particular framework. And we will suggest how the spending envelope can be better utilized by focusing on public procurement. And we'll briefly refer to private financing. So let's go to the next one. Next picture. Just very briefly, just to say that countries are struggling, particularly in the case of Bangladesh, in terms of generating sufficient revenue. And if you do not have sufficient revenue, that becomes problematic. If we move on, please. So how can we tap into new areas of revenue raising? One is, of course, fossil fuel subsidy reform. This is a tricky exercise because all reforms of this nature have income distribution effects. Vulnerable and poor people can obviously be affected if subsidies are removed or sharply reduced. So we have to find a way in which we can do this subsidy reform in a distribution neutral fashion, if that's possible. And in order to reflect climate change, we need to focus on carbon pricing. So fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing are two well-known but underutilized instruments for generating new sources of revenue. The next one, please. Thank you. When it comes to debt management, I'll spend a little bit of time on this particular graph. When it comes to debt management, rather than focusing on public debt at large, these days there's a greater emphasis on what we call thematic sovereign bonds. And those of you who work on international finance and fiscal policy will be fully aware and au fait with this. And we've just discovered recently that Bangladesh is poised to enter what's known as the thematic sovereign bond market. The idea is, okay, you issue bonds in private capital markets, sovereign bonds, but rather than as a generic bond, you issue it by tagging it to specific SDGs. In this case, Bangladesh has decided to issue what are known as orange bonds worth $1 billion geared towards the goal of gender equality and climate action within the SDGs. This is a very new initiative. It is probably at the planning stage, but the fact is that it is being thought through. But the whole idea of thematic sovereign bonds as an instrument to tap into financing SDGs has not been sufficiently explored in the South Asian region. And public procurement, just think about it. Public procurement, according to a lot of estimates, are up to about 14% of GDP across the world. And they account for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions in just about 4 industries, and 53% of such emissions in developing countries. So if we could find a way in which we can use public procurement to attain and tag it to the SDGs, and that's another way which is insufficiently explored and utilized by Bangladesh and other countries. Next slide, please. So we've got a sense, and of course it's a very short presentation. There's a lot more, if you like, promising research work that young scholars attached to Rapid and elsewhere would be interested in. We just start with some very generic recommendations like strengthening macro institutions to support strategic budgeting, improving the business and investment climate, promoting impact investment, green financing, crowdfunding. Of course, getting the business community to be involved in fighting climate change and engaging in climate action is terribly important. Adopting the integrated financing framework of the UNDP, which is quite different of the UN, it's quite different from conventional policy framework. And specific instruments like fuel subsidy reform, carbon pricing, and also health taxes, which is discussed more fully in our paper, to augment domestic revenues and support specific SDGs. Using thematic bonds and sustainable public procurement as complementary strategies as well. So that's certainly important. But I think we should emphasize, before I conclude, that despite the best efforts of the government, at the end of the day, without international cooperation, without greater concessional development financing, and without global collaboration across finance ministries, these proposals will not be able to reach the full potential. So on that note, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Yanatul Islam. So let us now open the floor. If you have any question or comment or feedback or anything you'd like to share with us, you can raise your hand, and or you can write your question in the chat section. We can read it out. So we have Robil Islam. Please unmute yourself and please be brief. Ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Rapid for organizing this, and also Professor Yen and Abi Bhai for this very insightful presentation. So I am Robiul Islam. I'm an economist for the Asian Development Bank. I have one question, and this is related to the productivity and the skills challenge that we have, and more related to the slides that Abi Bhai has just presented. So my question would be, for given the skills mismatch that we have and also the productivity issues, what could be some of the potential policy lessons that Bangladesh can follow about bridging this industry and academia collaboration? So when I've talked with the industry professionals, one of the things that they share that sometimes the businesses are incentivized to actually collaborate or invest in the research institutions or form some sort of collaboration. If they do that, they are incentivized by the government, like some sort of subsidies or tax rebates or some sort of exemption. So my question is that what will that be a starting, what could be a starting point or entry point for Bangladesh in this regard? So that's my question. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Robil Islam. So may I now request Mr. M. Tanjim Hassan. Please kindly introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I am Tanjim. I am currently working as a resource mobilization associate at the Center for Policy Dialogue. First of all, I would like to mention that the session was very insightful. I have learned a lot, and the presentations were very informative as well. But my question is specifically for Ovi Bhai, and I would like to ask him that the interim government has recently pledged to create 5 lakhs job in the next 2 years, and it has stated already that it has created around 86,000 jobs in the first 2 months. So I would like to ask that, given your expertise on this topic, do you think this goal is achievable? And if yes, then what would be your suggestions for achieving it? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanjim. Any other question? So I have one question to Ovi. So one interesting fact you presented is that the labor productivity is going up, is positive, but the real wage growth is negative. So to what extent automation or fourth industrial revolution is contributing to this divergence between labor productivity and real wage growth? And is there any policy that can be think of if this is the case? Whatever policy options government has to tackle this type of situation? We have 2 more questions. Should we take all the questions and then? Okay, thank you. Saiful Islam, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Ask your question very briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Din sir. I am Saiful Islam. I am a research associate at Rapid. Thank you, Obibai and Professor Anul, for presenting a very insightful presentation. I have one question for Obibai, which is that I have seen that you, in your presentation, you show that own account worker contributing family has been significantly increased from 2017 to 2022. My question is this particular indicator represents sole proprietorship or not? If it is, isn't it good for our economy? Thank you.
Many thanks, Saiful. Next, Rashik Aziz Kabir. Briefly introduce yourself and ask a question.
Thank you, Din sir. I am Rasik Ajiz Kabir. I am currently working as a research associate at Rapid. At first, I would like to thank Abhi Bhai and Professor Islam for a very lively presentation. So my question would be to Abhi Bhai. In the presentation, we saw that the average working hour in South Asia is quite high, and it is also seen that the level of informal employment in South Asia is quite high as well. So my question is there a correlation between the two things? Thank you.
May I now request Mr. Jilur Rahman, would you please kindly introduce yourself and ask a question?
Thank you, sir. This is Jilu Rahman. I am working as a Deputy Director at Rapid and Assistant Professor of Economics at Jagannath University. So these are not questions, but a few comments. Ovibhai mentioned that the population covered by at least one social protection schemes. I think that that figure is something overstated because that percentage of population also covers children and oldest people. So for working as people, there are very few programs which provides short-term temporary employment for public work related activities. And there are severe lacking in Bangladesh related to the social insurance schemes. So Bangladesh currently do not have any social insurance schemes for working as people. And again, one insurance scheme that is employment injury insurance scheme that is being piloted, but that is not in line with the social insurance principle. So probably after the pilot period, that will be in line with the principle of social insurance. But currently, that is not social insurance in line with the principle of social insurance. So there is several severe gap in this front for social protection schemes for working as people. That issue need to be addressed pretty soon amid Bangladesh's LDC graduation. Then the second issue is Ovivai mentioned that Professor Ian mentioned that there are need for fossil fuel surcharge or carbon tax related issues. So in this background, when Bangladesh is graduating towards non-LDCs from the list of LDCs, in this front, Bangladesh needs to make amendment in several issues on trade and investment related issues and need to take several reforms. So while the European Union countries, they are moving towards green innovation and other things, they already established their carbon market many years back. And they recently announced a deal that is called Green Deal. And Green Deal incorporates one critical area that is called carbon border adjustment mechanism. Under that mechanism, they are going to impose taxes on imported goods if that is not adequately carbon that is not adequately addressing carbon adjustment. So in this front, several partner countries and Bangladesh's competitor, including China and Vietnam, they are introducing their carbon market. So Bangladesh in this front need to establish a domestic carbon market and introduce several other carbon emission mechanism. Otherwise, the country will face several competitiveness pressure in the front of trade and development. That's my comment. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Jilur Rahman, for your informative and insightful comments. May I now request Abdul Jabbar Shakil? Could you please briefly introduce yourself and ask a question briefly?
Thank you for the opportunity. I am Abdul Jabbar Shakil, currently working as a research analyst in International Food Policy Research Institute. So my question is to Obi. From your presentation, it is clear that um, labor force participation is higher in rural area and it is mostly visible among female labor participation, but we all know that in rural area, agriculture sector mostly employs this huge population, and agriculture is a low productivity sector, and its contribution to the GDP is quite stagnant. According to my I checked the agriculture contribution to the GDP, and it is uh, around 11% over the last 4 years. So my final question, the actual question is, how can we channel this labor force from rural agriculture sector to more productive sector like construction and manufacturing sector? So yeah.
Thank you, Shakil. There's one question in the text box. So the question is from Afsara Tasneem. The question is, this question is to Mr. Obi. What are the main factors behind the high share of employment in agriculture sector among the youth group, age 15 to 20 in Bangladesh? So I think these are the all questions, but before moving to our presenters, we have one more question. Jubair Hussain, could you please kindly introduce yourself and ask a question? Thank you.
So much, Dean sir. This is Zubair Hussain. I work as Senior Deputy Director at Rapid. Sorry, I'm experiencing weak internet connection. That's why I will not be able to turn on my video. But thank you so much. Thanks to Professor Islam and Mr. Hussain. I mean, it's always a pleasure hearing Professor Islam. So, I mean, Bangladesh faces increasing challenges in mobilizing adequate financial resources to achieve the SDGs, particularly amid global economic uncertainties and domestic fiscal constraints. With rising public debt and narrow debt tax base, expanding fiscal space has become critical to sustaining developing investments while ensuring macroeconomic stability. So my question is, what should be the policy strategy for Bangladesh to expand its policy space to finance SDG related investments while maintaining macroeconomic stability, especially in the context of rising debt and limited revenue generation? Thank you.
Many thanks, Jubair Hussain. So before giving for back to our presenters and speakers, I have one question to Professor Islam. So from Ovi's presentation, we have seen that the number of employers actually has gone down. And from your presentation, we have seen that domestic resource mobilization is historically low in Bangladesh, but recently it has fallen and it's around 7% tax to GDP ratio. So given this context, how we can actually increase our domestic resource mobilization to spend like 15% of GDP on SDG related goals, whereas our total tax to GDP ratio is about 7%. You have mentioned some options like carbon tax, but it also there's a possibility that it will make our businesses less competitive in global markets. So there's a lot of trade-off. Whether you have any thought or any policy option that would be tailored to situation for a developing country like Bangladesh. So thank you so much. I think it's very late in Australia, so I would like to first request Professor Islam to make respond or comment or anything you'd like to discuss. Then I'll go back to Ovi.
The good news is that I'm actually in Dhaka. So
okay.
there's no problem of incompatible time zones, if you like.
Okay.
So but I think that if you don't mind, I've taken note of your very insightful and very important question, as well as Zubair's. What I'd like to do is, as Avi has received a lot of questions on his labor market overview paper, would I be able to request Avi to start the proceedings in terms of responses to the excellent questions that have been posed? Avi, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I was a little bit puzzled because so many questions directed to me, but I also feel that 50% of this question should be also to Professor Yan because it was a joint work. But anyway, anyway, I'll try to be very briefly try to answer some of those and most of those. I think first question on the skills mismatch and industry academia relation raised by Robul is a very interesting question. And on the productivity, I think it's very important. One of the tools that many countries follow is an apprenticeship-based training, which is a learning from the job, on-job training. So that is something that we in Bangladesh has not been able to do. So we try it in some technical vocational education by linking the employer and the trainee after completion of the classroom-based training. We do some 2-3 months practical in the TVET institutions and some sort of a small enterprises, workshop, garage, that kind of job. But it can be also a very strong and robust model with the mainstream formal jobs, like for economics department of Dhaka University and maybe Bragg University, BBA, North South, the other departments and engineering university. The last semester or 3 months, students are spending to the industry to work in those industry and corporates and development sector, even in the research think tanks and academia before they complete their bachelor or masters. So that kind of partnership is really needed to ideally reduce those skills mismatch, A, and B, in terms of the productivity question. I think there was another question related to productivity. I think it is important that the productivity is anyway positive. So what we need to probably understand that even if with a higher productivity in different sectors, we see a lower and declining wage. So that is where I was mentioning and alluding that the issue is the employers not giving the right kind of wage and the payment and income that is livable and is standard. And there are many minimum wage in different sectors in our country right now, which is even beyond the poverty line, to be very frank. So ideally, even in the formal sector, for example, if you take the salaries and the wages of the journalists who are in the media journalism and the print journalism, is very low in terms of the number of hours and work they do. That has no routine and no schedule. In any emergency situation, they work really hard. So those kinds of things will only be addressed with the right kind of wage setting, where your productivity will kind of significantly echo the wage that you receive from the labor market. The very classic competitive theory that marginal productivity equals to the wage is something that's definitely not happening. And on the other question that Dr. Dean Islam sir raised, is a very important question on the automation and the productivity, of course, and the impact of automation for IR or even technological transformation definitely has created a shortage in the structured industrial sector like RFG, where inclusion of high advanced technologies has resulted in job cuts of low-level skilled workforce, especially who are women at the very lower tier of the supply production unit, who are assistant machine operator, assistant senior operator. Those women actually lost jobs, and many youth in the RMG and some other sectors as well. It has created some opportunities. Ideally, with the inclusion of technology, we all know that the productivity actually is supposed to go high and is supposed to increase with the technology adaptation of advanced transformation of AI and everything. But unfortunately, if we don't revise the wages, it will not result in the benefit of the workers and the benefit of the workers who work in those technology intensive industries. The other part of the technology is because of this increasing AI and technology and gig economy, platform economy, there is a lot of outsourcing. There is a lot of food delivery kind of online Facebook e-market space where the productivity is very high in Bangladesh. But unfortunately, these are the workers who are not registered, who don't have contracts, who don't have an agreement with the employers. For those reasons, they are mostly exploited, even if they are working really good and performing well on this outsourced platform. And there is a more opportunity. The dilemma is Most of them work for big corporations like Food Panda, home delivery, or even who are doing outsourcing at home, working for some corporates and employer outside the country. But they are outsourcing these works to these people in our country who are young. Ideally they are not technically even employed by those employers. So even if you ask the question to those corporate employers who are outside of the country, they can easily avoid that. No, they are not actually our worker. We outsource them to some other entity, to some other agency. Try to find that agency and ask them the questions who are not giving them the right kind of worker rights and bargaining and collective bargaining. So that's a kind of thing that is coming up with the quick movement of technology. And on the own account worker, I think the own account worker is something that is basically not actually the self-employed. Own account worker means that who are actually working in their family by themselves, maybe with a partner, but not generating any job that is inducing profit. So ideally, increase of own account worker is basically not a very good sign for a developing country that is trying to be middle income country soon, where you see that a lot of this work do not actually get translated into the economic output, and as well as your income, work vulnerability do not get good attention. On the other hand, the self-employment is also something which is promising, which can actually accommodate some sort of employee, some sort of a small enterprise with 2 to 3 people working in a village community, in a mobile shop, AC repairing shop. But the problem in both of this, self-employed and own account, is kind of fragile and vulnerable worker, both of these categories, because they don't have the right kind of wages, contracts, and working environment and everything. And there is no kind of good relationship between the employer and employee, because there is no such a contract among this kind of employment situation. So that is it on, and I think on the last question asked by IFPRI colleague, that of course, I mean, if the agriculture labor share and employment is increasing in the rural area, we definitely know that these are mostly the subsistence farming and agriculture work, where the working condition is vulnerable, wages are low, there is discrimination and a lot of things. But end of the day, the question was that how we can utilize the agriculture in the rural areas and transform into those workers to the construction and mainstream manufacturing. My question would be, doesn't it also give a signal that maybe instead of bringing those workers to mainstream manufacturing like construction and building bridges, why don't we consider on agriculture manufacturing? So if there are works still in the rural areas to do and accommodate a lot of worker immediately in the agriculture subsistence work and with a larger share, it is always good to rather focus on the agriculture manufacturing, where we can take the agriculture seriously and do the industrialization and try to face the export-oriented agriculture manufacturing market, because that will be the most better utilization of the labor force of the country. Also, is an agriculture-based country at the end of the day, and it will also decentralize the economic development, push this Dhaka-based, urban-based development context to the rural economy as well, and also tackle the food security issues of the country. So I think that can be a good policy implementation. But of course, I mean, creating more industries, more manufacturing sectors beyond RMG has been always a talked about thing in the last 10, 15 years, which unfortunately never happened at that pace. Will be also useful to accommodate those surplus workers who are going to those agriculture vulnerable works. And on, I think more or less I covered. I just could not take that. Okay, the interim government's 5 lakh jobs target. And that's a very over-ambitious target, I would say, because I think 5 lakhs is not only the question about creating jobs. We have to be very careful that any quick creation of jobs cannot actually distort the labor market situation. Because if you create jobs so rapidly, you have to be also mindful that whether those jobs are decent or not, whether those contracts and jobs will still remain after the regime of this interim government. And there will be political parties coming who could have different priorities, different job and employment strategies. So it is good. The motivation is good. I'm not asking question and questioning the motivation, but it is important to rather create 1 lakh quality and sustained jobs rather than targeting creating 5 lakh, 500,000 jobs in a year and a half. Because if you see the labor market backlog, every year 2.2 million enters in the market, and we have estimated from the 7th and 8th 5-year plan that only 1 million, kind of 1 million, we have been more or less able to accommodate in the labor market. So every year there is a 1.5 million backlog accumulating. So that's the situation in the labor market. And also the employment elasticity is not very nice compared to the GDP growth rate of the country. At some point, it was actually declining. I mean, in last 5 years, it has increased a little bit. So it clearly depicts that the job growth has been very sluggish in the country. So we don't want to change the scenario, in one fine morning at a very speedy pace, but rather what will be important to stabilize the labor market with a step-by-step initiative for the decent work promotion. So I think these were all the questions. And one question I actually missed was on something on the correlation. That question I was not very clear that what was the exact question about. So maybe and I would request, if I have missed any good explanation, I would definitely request the veteran experienced employment branch chief, my co-author Yanatul Islam, to complement some of the questions which I may have failed to address properly. So over to Jan, sir.
Thank you, Avi. You've covered all the issues in a very comprehensive way and responded very well indeed. I just want to, because I think there are two specific questions and comments on fiscal space. Three, I think. One by Dr. Deen Islam, one by Jalur Rahman was mainly a comment, and then I think Zubair also asked a question about fiscal space. That's the perennial question. How do we do it? I think we know the principles of what needs to be done. Imagine a world in which the government is committed to raising domestic revenue as a proportion of GDP, is seriously committed by improving tax compliance, by enhancing the quality of tax administration, by widening the tax base. So it's possible to do that. And there are a number of evaluations which show in countries like Morocco and elsewhere that countries have the capacity to raise tax GDP ratio by anywhere up to 10% over time. If you look at our paper again, if you're able to access it, which you do, because we have submitted our PowerPoints and I think the paper, you'll see that a country like Nepal has reached pretty high tax to GDP ratio as well. So if Nepal can do it, why can't we? So it could be a lack of political commitment more than anything else. Technically, it is possible. And in any case, we've made some specific proposals where fiscal space can be enhanced. One is, of course, fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is only now being taken seriously. I think Pakistan has made an announcement. I'm not sure what's happening in Bangladesh per se, but there is considerable scope for generating new sources of revenue through fossil fuel subsidies. I like the point that Jalur made, is that before you can do carbon pricing, you need to create a carbon market. But if you do not even think in terms of carbon pricing, then you do not think in terms of a carbon market. So that's the principle. Carbon pricing can also be an important source of new revenue while sort of addressing climate change. Health taxes on sugary products, taxes on tobacco products, and so on and so forth is another source. And at the same time, they generate revenue. They can contribute to the health and well-being of the population. And the additional revenue can then be targeted towards something else. We refer to what we call a thematic sovereign bond market. Rather than sort of trying to enter into the sovereign bond market as a whole, we can be specific and tailor the bond market to specific themes. And Bangladesh has indicated a willingness to do so by saying that it will be ready at some point to issue what it calls orange bonds, targeting gender equality and climate change. There are countries in the world like Uzbekistan, Indonesia, that have actually become fairly serious players in the thematic sovereign bond market. So there are ways in which these can be done. So that's all I can say about fiscal space. And what I'm saying is the knowledge isn't lacking, the principles aren't lacking, but the implementation and how to translate those principles into practice represent the next challenge. So that's as far as I can say about fiscal space. I've noticed that it's already 9:14 or 9:15. I'll just take a couple of minutes to add to Avi's point. There's a lot of concern about wages. I always say that if you have a combination, I don't always say this, but I'm saying there are scholars. I mean, one scholar whose name is Peter Turchin has written a book called End Times, geared towards the American labor market, which says if you have a combination of stagnant real wages and high inequality, it's a recipe for political and social disaster down the line. At some point, there'll be some kind of an implosion, an explosion of unrest and so on. So that is perhaps what we're witnessing. You cannot have a society that can run in a way where real wages do not grow over long periods of time. That seems to me quite bizarre. I mean, if you can't do that, then there's something wrong. And what's wrong is the structure of the labor market. As Avi said, we're used to the idea that labor markets are competitive and that there is a link between productivity and wages. There isn't a link. And the primary reason that economists have increasingly discovered over time, particularly in the 2000s and beyond, is that the labor market in both developing and developed countries is monopsonistic, that employer power is rampant, and that employers are prepared to utilize their unequal bargaining power to the detriment of workers. That, unfortunately, is the harsh reality. And the only way, really, that we can handle that, by the way, the estimates show that there's a wage underpayment by up to 60%, that what you're worth and what you're paid, there's a gap in 60%. You're paid 60% below what you're worth, regardless of your occupation. And, Avi mentioned about all these energetic workers doing food delivery and so on and so forth for corporate entities that can easily squeeze those workers because they're not treated as workers with a contract. They're treated as self-employed operators who then have to take their responsibility for their own insurance and everything, etc. So I think that we really need to revisit the nature of the labor market in terms of institutions that currently prevail. And there is really no long-run response to that other than institutional changes that focus on strengthening collective bargaining, that focus on properly designed minimum wages, that focus on comprehensive social protection. Without that, and that focus in general on upholding labor rights, without that institutional framework and commitment, unfortunately, this kind of wage compression that we've seen will continue. I call this the Americanization of the Bangladeshi labor market, and that is unfortunately not a good sign for the future. And so instead of talking about 5 lakh jobs and so on and so forth, one should be talking about the improving living standards of all workers. And on that note, I think I'll conclude. Thank you very much to all of you for this wonderful opportunity to engage in this discourse. Avi, it's all yours.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks from my end, and I also like to thank everybody who have patiently made time and communicated. Hope, it was useful for the researchers and the colleagues who are joining, making time for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Islam and Mr. Hussain, for your time and very insightful presentation. I do apologize to Robiul Islam. We are over time. So let me now quickly request Professor Abu Yusuf to make some concluding remark. Yusuf sir.
No, Din Islam. Dr. Din, thank you. I think the audience heavily benefited from the discussions. And again, this is a continuous process, and hopefully we'll get the experts' opinion in future as well. on the not only the labor market, other dimension also, but very useful discussions indeed. Thank you so much. Thanks for the both presenter for their very insightful and comprehensive discussion, which add value, I think, on the issue of labor market in Bangladesh. Thank you, Dev.
Thank you, Yusuf sir, and I'd like to express our gratitude to Professor Islam and Mr. Hussain to enlighten us with many labor market issues. And I thank you all to join us this evening, and I would like to invite you to join our next webinar in another interesting topic. Till then, stay safe. Take care. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, colleague. Thank
আপনি
you.
কতদিন
Bye.
আছেন বাংলাদেশে? বাংলাদেশে কতদিন আছেন?
একটু আনমিউট করতে হবে স্যার।
স্যার একটু আনমিউট করতে লাগবে প্রফেসর।
সরি, আমি আপনার পুরো রোজার মাসটা আছে।
তাহলে একদিন আসেন আমাদের র‍্যাপিড অফিসে, আসেন একদিন
ইনশাআল্লাহ।
জি এটা গুলশান,
আমি দেখি, আমি
জি
হ্যাঁ আমি আবির সাথে যোগাযোগ করে দেন উইল অর্গানাইজ দ্যাট। যেদিন আপনি
চলে আসবো, আমি সহ চলে আসবো স্যার, সমস্যা নেই।
ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ ফর দি জেনারেস ইনভিটেশন ওয়ান্স अगेन। ইটস বিন আ রিয়েল প্লেজার। ভালো থাকবেন আপনারা সবাই, ভালো থাকবেন।
আসসালামু আলাইকুম।
থ্যাংক ইউ ভাই, কথা হবে। থ্যাঙ্কস, বাই
বাই বাই
বাই বাই।
আসসালামু আলাইকুম।